Hi, welcome to the G Research Open Source Software Outreach Podcast, the GR-OSS OUT podcast. I'm your host, Jay Faulkner, and we've got a good guest for you here today. We have Dejan here. Dejan, why don't you tell us, give us your full name and tell us a little bit about what you've been doing in open source and, maybe if you've been involved in any communities or places people might know you from.
Hey, Jay. Thanks for, I'm really excited for being your guest in your podcast. So thanks for the invite. And so my name is Dejan Pejchev. I'm a software engineer. Well, from a couple of years back, I'm exclusively an open source software engineer from Belgrade, Serbia. Most of my career, I worked in closed source, but I always used and had a passion for open source, and we built so many solutions which made money because of open source that I really wanted to give back to the community. And after joining the G Research open source team, I am really glad that I got an opportunity to contribute to popular open source projects, meet a lot of interesting people whose open source projects I used over years and years of my career. So,
So the last couple of years you've been working on open source, what projects have you had the opportunity to contribute to, or what's your primary focus been?
So I started with Armada. I think, actually, no. Before Armada, I was a founding engineer of a really interesting project which we later open sourced. It was called Cloud Knit. It was an abstraction over infrastructure as code. It was environment as code. And that was a really interesting project. It was short-lived, but I'd like to think of it. This was my introduction to.
Let's talk about that a little bit though before we go into your more modern stuff. I'm curious, what was the name of the project again?
Cloud Knit.
Cloud Knit, like KNIT?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So we'll make sure to get a link to that project, even if it's defunct, down in the description below so people can look. So what sort of what led you to not want to work on that project anymore, or sort of to take a different direction?
We were young, we were foolish. We thought you just start an open source project and the community appears, starts using it. So the idea was really cool and interesting. So you have your infrastructure as code, your Terraform, whatnot, you write your modules. And with Terraform, you have your issue where either you break down your infra into much smaller modules, which are a pain when you want to apply all of them, or you write a monolith module, which is easier to be applied, but it has a ton of stuff and it also is easy to maintain. Our idea was, okay, let's do an abstraction over it. Let's talk environments. Environment is a collection of components, and a component can be a Terraform module, a Pulumi module, a Helm chart, Argo CD application, whatnot. So now it's using YAML, every DevOps favorite tool. What's DevOps? It's a box of YAML. So, So that was our idea. Okay, let's build something where you write these components where they can be, like you mentioned, Terraform, Pulumi modules, whatnot. And we'll take care of running them. You could get ordering, build DAGs. We'll take care of the life cycle, alert you when things get drift or get out of sync, all of that. The idea was pretty nice, but afterwards, when I started being involved more and more in open source, when I saw the importance of DevRels and how you should advertise, how other projects do it in big conferences, that's when I saw, okay, it's not that easy to start and promote open source project. And the biggest issue in open source, you have 9 competing standards and you're like, okay, now is the time to build a standard which will unify all of them, and you end up with 10 competing standards. So
yeah, and I think, like, given the space we work in of like cloud stuff now, spoiling the rest of the conversation, we're both in cloud stuff. I think we might see that a little more than other people do. Of that, I always have started describing it to people as there's this idea of like making something simple, but no one has the same idea of what simple is. What's simple in my environment, what's simple in your environment are different things. That the complexity comes from trying to meet, like a dozen different definitions of simple at the same time. And I think a lot of people learned that lesson the hard way by trying to reinvent the wheel because they don't understand why some decisions were made. And they just sort of get to follow in the footsteps of people who've gone before them with DevOps tooling or cloud tooling or whatever to understand maybe why things are shaped the way they are. Or sometimes, in the case of Kubernetes, maybe they unlock some sort of new abstraction that's helpful to people. So I know that after CloudNet sort of died out, we started looking some at Armada. And, full disclosure, I worked on Armada a little bit, more DevRel than actual code. To be honest, I learned a lot about how much I don't know about batch computing trying to work on Armada. So when did you get started on it? And like, have you been on it since the beginning? Like, even if you weren't there at the start, can you maybe give us the story of Armada starting from the beginning and going on?
So Armada exists for some time now. It started as an internal project. I think it's in its 5th, 6th year, something like that. It was open sourced a couple of years ago, maybe 3, 4 years ago. Don't take my word on it. So I started on Armada more than 2 years ago, and actually my start was pretty interesting. With Armada struggled a lot with quick start. So we all for quite some time we bragged and advertised, Armada is the most scalable solution. Armada scales to millions, and Armada can do this, Armada can do that. And then, okay, people get sold on it, get excited. How do we try it out? And we're like, yeah.
So before we get too deep into the mechanics of that, can you maybe tell people what Armada solves? Like, let's get the, what is Armada useful for those folks? Even if why would they even want to get started with it? I guess.
So Armada is a multi-cluster Kubernetes native batch scheduler. So what does that mean? Kubernetes native meaning it is designed to schedule workloads in Kubernetes. Batch scheduler, well, you schedule a ton of workloads, and multi-cluster. So that's one of the most interesting parts of it. With Armada, you can join multiple Kubernetes clusters into a single compute farm, which allows you to exceed the limitations when dealing with a single cluster.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is you talk about how long how long Armada's been around. That it's been around for 5 or 6 years. And Kubernetes has covered a lot of space and scaling up before then. I bet that the need for Armada was much higher. Even, it still exists today because no cloud can scale infinitely, but especially back when Kubernetes was limited to maybe 5,000 instances or so, like it was in the early days, that would be a big limitation. So Armada helps overcome that through some sort of, like I said, I'm not a batch scheduling expert, so we might go into the details of how it works later. But so I'm sorry, before I derailed you, you were telling us about how you were working to maybe scale Armada down a little bit, that it had been worked on to be giant and scalable across huge clusters, but that y'all needed to make it fit into a development environment.
So, yeah, like I said, Armada struggled with quick start a bit for quite some time because Armada is heavyweight. I mean, it uses some heavyweight dependencies. Well, then it needs to, because with just the what Kubernetes offers you, you cannot reach that amount of scale. Like if you want to schedule millions and millions workloads per day, well, etcd and Kubernetes interface just won't cut it. But in order for people to reach millions and millions, well, they first want to try it out. Okay, let me see how they set it up, how they interact with it. I mean, no company will just say, okay, now we'll buy tons of hardware and use Armada. I mean, everybody wants to test it out first, look and feel how does it work. But recently we improved that, and we got, now we have a simple command which you can use to run Armada. We even created an Armada operator to make the experience even more better and easier. And we got some quite good feedback on it. And more companies are adopting Armada. So I think we are on the right track.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting. So I know that I understand at least that you maybe, you still work on Armada some, but I think you're starting to move over into the greater Kubernetes ecosystem a little bit. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that journey, maybe about the process of getting like that first thing merged into Kubernetes, or if there was ever an inflection point where you felt like maybe you shifted from being an outsider to someone who is an active contributor?
That's actually a really interesting story. So when I joined the growth team, the G-Research open source team, some 2 years ago, I remember we initially discussed about how to run Armada, and my manager then he called me for a sync. I didn't even know what it was. I thought it was about running Armada, and I prepared a document, a presentation, 5 different ways on how to run it. And I started presenting, being all professional. You can do this, you can do this. It's like, can you please shut this down? And this was my first week with the growth team. And he was like, can you please stop this? I just called you to ask you, do you want to go to KubeCon in Valencia? So, and we went to KubeCon, and since Valencia, we are pretty much standard on all KubeCons. And that's where we started to meet interesting people from Kubernetes to grow connections. And over time, they started pinging us, hey, can you assist on this? Can you assist on that? And that's how I started to work my way up the Kubernetes ecosystem. So yeah, that was an interesting story, because I thought somebody is calling me for a report for a technical report on how to run Armada, and it ended up with a call to Valencia. And yeah, that was really nice. And those conferences, KubeCon is amazing. We met and created some really good connections there. And yeah, I met a lot of people with whom I stay in touch with, whom I discuss, whom reach out for assistance on Kubernetes, because Kubernetes, it has hierarchy, it has structure, code quality is good, but it's lacking contributors and maintainers. So yeah, they are always welcomed. So that's, I started from really basic things. I got an opportunity to promote to beta, interesting feature in the job controller. So yeah, from a simple conference to contributing to Kubernetes, I think that was an interesting journey.
Well, you say it's simple, but I pull a couple of things out of that that's really meaningful and I think could help other people who are trying to make this transition. First of all, is I think especially in this world, honestly, especially a post-COVID world, we all have a tendency to want to do everything virtually, to want to do everything in writing async. Heck, we're recording a podcast while thousands of miles away from each other. But there's a huge amount of value in in-person FaceTime in large open source communities. There's a huge amount of noise out there that hits people who work on those large open source communities, but that usually is not the case for someone who comes up to you at a conference or in person and shows that type of interest. So don't discount the fact that you were at the KubeCon, you were present. That made a big difference. And the other one is that clearly, if they kept pulling you in, you were doing things that were trustworthy, right? Like you were providing good work, you were moving through. And that's really the trick to almost every active open source project, especially if it's sort of corporately governed in the way that OpenStack or Kubernetes is that you just have to go in there, get noticed, and develop a little bit of trust, and that'll grow over time. And so I really like that story because I think that matches a lot of people's experiences with this as well. Yeah, so that's neat to hear about how you got started in the Kubernetes community. Are there any active projects you're working on right now? Any cool features coming down the pipe or interesting bugs that you've been working on that you might could shine a light on for us?
In Kubernetes.
Yeah, in Kubernetes.
Oh, so currently, no. Currently, we started a new project called Unicorn History Server, but I can say briefly about that. Or with
Like Unicorn or Unicorn?
unicorn, like a unicorn.
Okay, got it. I didn't know if you were talking about because there's the runner, like the G unicorn. I have no idea how that's pronounced. If it's like unicorn or if it, I don't know. But okay, so a unicorn history server. What does that do?
So you have your another bed scheduler in Kubernetes called Unicorn Scheduler. So what we want to build is a history server which persists all events which are emitted by the Unicorn server because, Unicorn doesn't have that great persistence for more historical records. So, I think the community will like it. We got some interest, some good feedback on it. So we're almost ready to release our first version of it. So that's where I currently am.
What's the use case in mind for that? Like auditing?
Oh yes, if you're doing large scale bed scheduling, want to track, want to keep the history of what happened, how many failures, timings, all of that. I mean, data is really valuable nowadays, and you can process it however you want and extract maybe some knowledge which you, well, with your own eyes, which isn't that easily noticeable. So, I mean, every data warehousing solution is valuable. So,
Yeah, that's I think a lot of people think about utility computing when they think about cloud services and stuff, and everyone always forgets that if you're going to utility bill something, you have to have a meter, and so keeping track of things, keeping track of who's done what, is always super important in those kind of ecosystems. But Kubernetes is fun. I like talking about cloud stuff because obviously that's what I know a little bit more about. But I do want to dig in a little bit more on Armada because I know that that's been an important part of what's empowered G research. And honestly, I sort of see a lot of it as like one of the cornerstone projects of growth, right? It's a pretty good success story, having been CNCF incubated. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about your journey on that project? Like if you started out working on, that quick start, what is maybe some interesting things that's happened across the 2 years you've worked on Armada?
so Armada is really interesting, and code base is quite nice. And I did what interesting thing I did. I did the initial support for preemption in Armada, various optimizations for better utilization of the compute farm. Because I mean, with Armada, you can join tons of compute into a single farm, and well, I mean, you probably paid good money for that hardware, and you want to be utilized as much as possible. So that was nice. Those were interesting contributions. I think I'd highlight the quick start a lot because we were having issues with it and we couldn't provide a single command to install it. And we had there was this guy Carlos Santana who also has a podcast, and he goes through CNCF projects and tries to run them based on the project quick start guide and project readme. So it also sounds scary to us. And well, the first part we didn't do well, but with the new quick start we did well. And after that, I mean, our community started to grow on Slack, and more people were asking with questions. Hey, I noticed this in the API. Hey, I know how they use this instead of, hey, I'm getting this Helm error, or I'm getting this. So that was really nice. I did a lot of public speaking about Armada.
Yeah, actually, you have a talk coming up soon, don't you?
Well, my current talk is more Kubernetes related, but that was really great news. So me and a colleague of mine, actually, I think your previous guest, Jonathan Januzzi.
Yeah, he was our episode 2 guest.
Okay, so previous. Yeah. Our session got accepted at KubeCon in Salt Lake City now in November. We'll be talking about how you can write Kubernetes scheduler plugins using WebAssembly and also test them at scale using Kubernetes Quark or Kubernetes without kubelets. So yeah, we have a lot of hype words, buzzwords. So I think we caught attention with that one.
Yeah, I made a point not to ask Jonathan about WebAssembly when he was on the show. I don't necessarily share the vision of WASM that other people do, but it's always interesting technology to see how people stack and adjust things together. Uh, so one thing that we always like to cover in the podcast is sort of like the rough moments, sort of we call it like our gross moments, because we want to highlight that anytime you're getting involved in an open source community or you're getting involved in something new, that you're going to hit bumps, but it's fine, you'll get over it. So can you maybe share a gross story from your history working on open source, or maybe even go into the closed source if there's something relevant that you can share with our audience and let them know how you overcame it, so that they can understand they can overcome things too?
So, what I struggled with in the beginning and where I was lost, I was like, okay, I want to contribute, but how? Because in bigger projects, I mean, you cannot just open an issue or open a pull request. There is a good chance that maintainers won't notice it, especially in Kubernetes. And I struggled a bit. I was, okay, I have time, I want to help, but how? I mean, my PRs don't get noticed. Eventually, they get stale and closed. My GitHub issues don't attract, neither likes nor comments. And this entry level is hard. Conferences and all of that helps, because when you meet people in real life, when you talk about them, you build a different level of trust. When you say, hey, I want to contribute, I want to help out, it sounds differently than when it comes from a Slack message. Or, people don't see you like a GitHub handle or a virtual avatar. So, conferences, at least in my case, conferences help that. And once you are in, it quickly becomes fun, because you can then, approach anybody and they are willing to lead the deep tech conversations. They are willing to look at your pull requests. They take your GitHub issues or whatnot more seriously. So that was my biggest issue in the beginning. Like, okay, how? I want to help, but how? And well, you need to break in by yourself.
I think a lot of people who've worked in open source have had a bit of an experience like that, depending on which side you're at. Like, I think many of us who've been around a while have maybe been on both sides of that, because I've always said that there's always a larger number of people willing to volunteer to do work than there are actually doing the work, meaning that the number of times that an open source project you approach to offer to do something, or things of that nature, there have been 5 people who came before you who made those same promises and then never showed their face again. And so that is kind of a bar that naturally appears over time, as you get a little cynical because you're drowning under a lot of work. Someone comes and offers to help. It seems too good to be true, and often it is. But if you get someone who's invested enough to go to a conference, you get someone who's invested enough to go out on their own and write a feature, or maybe fix a bug that's not impacting them, or do something, giving back a little bit to the community, then maybe the community will be able to give a little bit back to them, give them a little bit of attention, even if that's just code reviews. It's very empowering in open source when you do that transition of realizing that writing code is maybe the easiest thing you can do in an open source project. That code review, that having those conversations, building consensus, even the DevRel stuff you're talking about. I cringed when you told us about the podcast where that guy, and we'll get the name of that podcast. We'll make sure to link it down there, specifically the episode he did on Armada, if there is one published yet. But it made me cringe a little bit because those are definitely the places where things tend to hurt, where things tend to rot a little bit. So that's really fun to hear about. So I appreciate you coming and talking with us for a while, Dejan. This has been a fun conversation about Kubernetes and Armada. If you're listening to this on the podcast, you can go to podcast.gr-oss.io and we'll have links to all the various projects we've talked about today, the other podcasts, things like that. Or if you're watching us on YouTube, just look right down below in the description and we're going to have links to all that stuff. And I'm probably going to have some links somewhere around in here toward the end of the video that you can click on to get to lots of the Armada content we have right here on the G Research YouTube channel. Please come and check it out. There's a nice technical overview to Armada if this has whet your appetite for batch scheduling a little bit. There's more stuff up there about Gross's approach to managing open source in general in Armada. Lots of good information up there. And so please do check it out. But for now, this has been the G Research Open Source Outreach Podcast, the Gross Out Podcast. I'm Jay, and on behalf of myself and Dejan, thanks for listening. Have a good day. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you.